Picture this: a boy about 16 years old stands under the blazing Roman sun. He's stripped bare not of clothing that was gone long ago, but of dignity, of identity. They weighed him like grain, exactly 37 Roman pounds of muscle bone and potential profit. His weight was scribbled onto a wax tablet right alongside tallies of olive oil jars and amphorae of wine. To the auctioneer, he was no different from livestock, no more significant than a barrel of goods on sale. The man's voice echoed across the forum, calling out the boy's attributes like he might describe a horse or ox. Strong shoulders, no visible scars, good teeth, about 16 years of age. As if that mattered to anyone here, nobody had asked the boy his age. No one cared. The morning light poured through tattered awnings above the slave market, casting sharp, angular shadows across a crowd that had learned not to look potential buyers in the eye. The air was heavy with the stink of sweat, unwashed skin olive oil from nearby shops, and the sharp metallic scent of fear, a smell so strong that no amount of incense could hide it. And the sound of chains clinking quietly whenever a slave shifted their weight or tried to ease their discomfort that had become the grim soundtrack of this place. Commerce in its rawest form. In that crowd stood Marcus Crassus Aquila, arms folded, eyes cold and calculating. He studied the boy, noted the broad chest, the long limbs. Germanic stock, he thought, tough, durable. The kind of build that might last in the arena. A lanista, a trainer of gladiators, ran his fingers down the boy's forearms, checking for old fractures, testing his joints. It wasn't cruelty, it was business. A quality check before making a purchase. The auction started at 50 denarii. Quickly the price rose. Other buyers saw what Aquila saw. A Thracian lanista raised his hand. A merchant from Syria joined the bidding. But Aquila had deeper pockets. He wasn't just seeing flesh and bone, he was seeing the roars of a crowd, coins raining into his coffers. At 120 denarii, the gavel fell. Done. A scribe jotted down the sale: one male slave, Germanic origin, purchased by Marcus Crassus Aquila, destined for the gladiator school. The ink dried faster than the boy could process what had happened. No name would be given. Not yet. In this world, names weren't gifts, they were earned through blood. The boy was led to a corner where the branding took place. The iron glowed orange, Aquila's mark searing into flesh. The hiss of burning skin filled the air, mixing with the other smells of the market. But the boy made no sound. Maybe he already understood silence was survival's first lesson. Shackles were clamped onto his ankles, linked by a chain, just long enough for walking, but not running. The metal was polished smooth by generations of captives who had worn it before him. A legacy of captivity passed from one pair of legs to the next. And as he was led away, nothing in the market paused. Life went on. Other bodies were inspected, price sold. The machinery of human commerce had no space for individual tragedy. The boy's story was just one of thousands. If you're watching this and want to see how entire systems can reduce people to products, hit that like button. Subscribe to learn how cruelty doesn't start with monsters, it starts when systems make it normal. They called it training, but really it was preparation for a life without choices. The boy who cost 120 denarii got assigned to a sleeping space number 47. A narrow slot in a dormitory packed beyond capacity, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The brand on his shoulder still oozed clear fluid, staining the rough wool tunic they'd thrown at him. And here pain wasn't just inevitable, it was currency. The more you could take without making a sound, the more respect you earned from men who had themselves been broken and rebuilt. The school was a fortress, 3 acres behind towering stone walls just outside Rome. Inside order. The courtyard divided by purpose. One section for weapons practice, another for conditioning, a corner for medical care. Barracks where 200 men were crammed into space meant for 100. The walls were dark with sweat stained with blood. These stones had watched men transform not into heroes, but into instruments of violence. At dawn, the sounds began. The crack of wooden swords on shields. The guttural grunts of men pushing their bodies past their limits. Commands barked in Latin, Greek, broken Germanic. The boy learned fast, understanding the words wasn't required, only obedience. When they pointed, he moved. When they gestured, he copied. Language didn't matter when every command meant the same thing: do as you're told. Food was science. Barley porridge to build bulk. Dried beans for strength. Olive oil for fat. Watered wine to hydrate. Portions calculated to build muscle, never excess. Hunger was constant, but just mild enough to keep a man fighting harder. Freedom might be a dream, but food, that was survival. Inside the school, there was a strict order. Veterans who'd survived matches wore leather bands on their arms. They were the kings of this broken kingdom. Newcomers learned to stay out of the way to earn approval. The veterans were harder on them than the Roman trainers were. Cruelty, once learned, was easy to pass along. 6 hours every day were dedicated to conditioning. The boy's soft hands split and bled, calluses forming like armor. His shoulders thickened from lifting stones. His legs grew powerful from endless drilling. Every change in his body was tracked by trainers who adjusted his regimen with the precision of engineers. 10,000 practice thrusts, 10,000 blocks, 10,000 footwork drills. The sword wasn't just in his hand anymore. His hand had become the sword. Sleep was scarce. 4 hours at a time on straw mats that stank of the last man who used them. Dreams, when they came, were of another life that felt more distant each day. His mother's voice, his village's scent, they faded. The schedule didn't allow for memories. 3 months in, and the boy could kill 6 different ways with a gladius. He could disable with his bare hands. He could take pain that would have once shattered him. But the most terrifying change, he no longer dreamed of escape. His world had shrunk to this school, his future the next drill, his worth the nod of approval from his masters. He was no longer the boy who'd been sold. He was becoming something else entirely. 3 months after that branding iron had burned his flesh, the boy had become someone the other men called Ferox, a name given not out of affection, but to mark the fierceness he showed during weapons drills. He didn't choose it. Names here weren't chosen. They were assigned, earned through blood, sweat, and survival. Ferox didn't sound like the boy he used to be, but that boy was fading fast. The language of family had been twisted into the language of ownership. Ferox learned to call Marcus Crassus Aquila father and his fellow gladiators brothers. The words felt strange at first, but soon they became as natural as lifting his sword. His Germanic accent softened under the constant hammering of Latin commands. His shoulders were broader. His hands, once soft, were now hardened and scarred tools of war. But the biggest change, he'd stopped asking himself if he could ever go home. At evening meals, Aquila would stroll through the hall like a father checking on his sons. He'd squeeze a shoulder here, give a word of encouragement there. Sometimes he handed out small rewards, an extra hunk of meat, a cup of pure wine, a break from dawn drills. And the men, these hardened, brutalized men, craved that recognition. Ferox felt his chest warm whenever Aquila praised his form or his shield work. When days passed without a word, he'd train harder, desperate for that flicker of approval. It wasn't love, not really, but it felt close enough to keep him going. Among the gladiators, a kind of family order took shape. Brutus, a Gaul who had survived 18 arena matches, claimed Ferox as a protege. It looked generous on the surface, but really it helped Brutus secure his place as an elder brother, a leader in the eyes of the others. The competition for Aquila's attention was hidden under layers of supposed brotherhood. Gladiators cheered each other's victories, shared food, offered comfort, but always while calculating, always watching for weakness. Love and manipulation blurred until they were impossible to tell apart. Aquila encouraged bonds beyond the arena. He didn't stop relationships between gladiators and the female slaves who worked the school. If anything, he encouraged it. The more ties his fighters had to the place, the more reasons they had to stay loyal, the less likely they were to dream of escape. Ferox found himself drawn to a Germanic girl named Silva. When she was near, the stone walls of the compound felt a little less cold. But neither of them saw that their feelings were part of the same system. Their bond was as manufactured as his sword technique. The school didn't just train bodies, it shaped minds. During Saturnalia, the festival of reversal slaves served food to the gladiators. Trainers waited on their fighters. Even Aquila joined in performing chores he'd usually order done. For a few days, the world flipped upside down. It felt like freedom. But when the festival ended and things went back to normal, the contrast made their usual chains feel more like gifts than cages. It was clever. It was calculated. Medical care at the school was top tier, not out of kindness, but out of profit. A broken gladiator was a wasted investment. Galen, the school's physician, could set a bone as well as any city doctor. He stitched wounds with silk-treated infections, with imported herbs. The care felt like love to men who'd forgotten what real love looked like. Evenings were for storytelling. Veterans told of arena victories turning horror into tales of heroism. Young fighters like Ferox soaked it in, learning to see future pain as potential glory. When a gladiator died, his funeral was a grand spectacle. Aquila spoke of courage, loyalty, honor. The ceremonies turned death into beauty. Martyrdom looked noble rather than tragic. And Ferox, he started to believe it. He would have died to protect this family. The system had built a chain stronger than any shackle love. 6 months after the auction, Ferox stood beneath the Colosseum for the first time. The roar of the crowd vibrated through the stone walls, thousands of voices blending into one hungry sound. He gripped his gladius, the same sword he'd thrust at straw targets 10,000 times, but today it would meet flesh. That morning, Silva had braided a leather cord around his wrist, a token of affection, a blessing, or maybe a curse. Across the arena stood Demetrius, a Thracian gladiator, with 5 matches behind him. They had eaten together, trained side by side, laughed at the same jokes. Now they were enemies, 20 feet apart. 2 men, 2 lives, 1 outcome. The editor of the games, a politician looking to win favor, raised his white cloth. The crowd hushed, eager. Ferox could hear his own heartbeat, the shift of Demetrius's feet, the creak of leather. Then the cloth dropped. Demetrius struck first his blade, aiming for the small gap between Ferox's shield and armor. Ferox reacted without thinking, shield up, sword out, countering with a thrust toward his opponent's ribs. Steel clashed. The crowd gasped in one collective breath. They circled, studied, waited. This wasn't chaos. This was a dance, a deadly professional dance. Then it happened. Demetrius stumbled. Ferox didn't know if it was exhaustion or a trap, but the Thracian's shield dipped just for a heartbeat. That was enough. Ferox's blade slid between his collarbones, finding the hollow where life pulsed strongest. Blood sprayed, painting the sand in bright arcs. Demetrius's eyes went wide, not in pain, but in shock, as if he couldn't believe this was the end. The crowd erupted, a roar so loud Ferox felt it in his bones. Their love hit him like a wave, more intoxicating than wine, more addictive than opium. For the first time, he felt the crowd's approval, and it filled him with something close to joy. Demetrius crumpled, his blood soaking into the sand like rain into earth. The editor signaled attendants dressed as Karen came to drag the body away. The crowd had already moved on, ready for the next fight. Demetrius was forgotten before his blood cooled. Ferox raised his sword toward the imperial box without thinking. The Empress watched from her seat, draped in purple silk. Ferox felt grateful to the system that had given him this moment. As he left the arena, still hearing the cheers, he realized something chilling. He didn't feel guilt. He felt pride. The crowd's love had turned killing into art. That night, as Ferox cleaned his sword and shield, he caught himself looking forward to the next fight. The rush, the applause, the warmth of being seen, admired, it was stronger than fear. And that was how the transformation began. In the months that followed, Ferox became more than just another gladiator. His name started to mean something. After his 10th victory, after his 15th, crowds began to chant it as he entered the arena. Merchants outside the Colosseum sold little oil lamps stamped with his image, gladius raised in triumph, foot on the chest of a faceless foe. Kids carved wooden figures to play out his battles. His scars became a map of stories the city knew by heart, the line across his ribs from a Thracian's last desperate swing, the pale patch on his shoulder from a German's axe. And slowly, the boy who had once dreamed of home of freedom disappeared under this new identity. A painter splashed his portrait across tavern walls, muscles, exaggerated scars edited to look more heroic. Poets wrote verses about his courage. Women from powerful families sent him tokens, silk robes, perfume notes full of admiration. Of course, these same women would never acknowledge him outside the arena, but that didn't matter. The attention was addictive. Marcus Crassus Aquila realized Ferox's fame was worth more than his sword. Wealthy citizens paid for private shows, no deadly matches, just demonstrations. Ferox would show his technique against condemned criminals. The rich would lean close, studying his scars, thrilled to touch the body that had brought them so much excitement. When he stepped into the arena, 50,000 voices chanted his name in unison. The sound felt like it could lift him off the sand. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a symbol, And in those moments, it was easy to forget that he was still a slave. The school moved him to a private cell, a real bed, decorations made from the gifts he'd received. Comfort, yes, but also isolation. The better to keep him separate to ensure he had no allies. Younger fighters looked to him like he was a god. They copied how he fought, how he walked, even how he spoke. And Ferox, for all his doubts, found himself giving advice as if survival was nobility, as if crowd manipulation was some kind of virtue. Betting on his matches became so complex that bookmakers hired scholars to calculate the odds. His body, his performance had become the foundation of an entire economy. Information brokers sold details of his training sessions to gamblers. His life wasn't just his anymore, it was a commodity that fed hundreds of people. Then came the day the emperor requested an audience. A quick meeting, praise for his loyalty and his skill. It lasted less than 10 minutes, but it left Ferox glowing. The emperor had seen him, had recognized him. In a world that treated him like property, that moment felt like being made whole. Merchants plastered his face on everything from wine jugs to weapon ads. Brothels named their best workers after him. His fame spread farther than he ever could have dreamed, but it was a prison more secure than any chain. How could he run? His face was everywhere. His scars were as recognizable as a senator's seal. There was no escape. Ferox saw it clearly on sleepless nights. The more beloved he became, the more trapped he was. His fame, which felt like freedom, was actually his tightest shackle. Every cheer, every gift, every poem layered another brick onto the walls of his cage. 6 years after that first auction, after 43 arena appearances, the cost of it all began to show. His knee shattered in his 28th fight, burned with every step. His sword arm, sliced and stitched too many times, trembled after each bout. The crowd, so skilled at sensing blood, began to hear the cracks in the legend. Their cheers shifted, a new hunger in their tone. They wanted to see how the mighty would fall. That day, his opponent was Kush, a Nubian gladiator, sharp, quick, patient. They both knew what was at stake. The consul hosting the games had paid to make it unforgettable. The sands sparkled with powdered gold. Musicians played as the fighters entered. Morning singers waited in the wings. The first cut came fast, too fast. A gash across Ferox's thigh. Not fatal, not yet, but deep enough to slow him. The next strike opened his sword arm, blood running down to his fingers, making his grip slippery. The crowd roared louder, not with joy, but with the desperate excitement of spectators sensing that the end was near. Ferox fought on, but he knew it was over. His attacks were slower, his footwork sloppier. His gladius felt heavy. Kush showed no cruelty, just the respect of a fellow professional doing his job. Each blow was precise, meant to weaken, not to kill. The crowd drank it in, savoring the fall of their champion. When Ferox finally dropped to one knee, shield still raised, the arena fell silent. Kush stood waiting. The editor of the games looked to the crowd for their will. The votes were mixed, but the tide was clear. The editor's thumb turned down. Kush ended it cleanly, his blade slipping into the space where neck meets shoulder. Ferox felt nothing beyond the first shock. His blood poured into sand that had tasted thousands of deaths. The crowd's roar rose, a mix of sorrow and satisfaction. They had witnessed art, tragedy, and entertainment all in one perfect ending. The musicians started their death songs, turning brutality into something that felt like beauty, wrapping murder in ritual so the crowd could feel they'd witnessed sacrifice, not slaughter. Attendants dressed as Mercury checked that Ferox was truly dead, prodding his body with hot iron rods. Others costumed as Karen dragged him away, his blood leaving a dark trail across the golden sand, like a comet's tail fading into night. The spectators watched until the gate closed. Then, as always, they shifted their attention to the next fight, the next possible hero, the next chance to see glory born and blood spilled. In the tunnels beneath the arena, other gladiators cleaned their weapons. They spoke little. Ferox's death reminded them of their own futures. But the machine didn't stop. There were more shows to run, more crowds to please. Ferox had played his part brilliantly. Now it was someone else's turn. His body, once a boy worth 120 denarii, once a hero to thousands, was processed with the efficiency of a supply officer handling military rations. His blood, still warm, was collected into bronze vessels. Some believed drinking the blood of a fallen gladiator cured epilepsy. Physicians sold it by the dram. Their faces serious, their prices steep. Silva, the girl who had once braided leather cords around Ferox's wrist, was tasked with cleaning those vessels. Her tears mixed with the water as it ran red down the drains. But the system had no space for grief, only profit. Ferox's flesh was cut by experts who knew anatomy as well as any surgeon. The choicest cuts were served at wealthy banquets. Senators and merchants believed eating a gladiator's meat would give them courage. His muscles, once weapons in their own right, became a delicacy. His bones were ground to powder, mixed into ointments meant to heal wounds or boost virility. Apothecaries sold the bone meal in jars stamped with symbols promising strength. Even his skin was preserved, the scars treated like trophies. One merchant mounted a strip of Ferox's hide bearing the final fatal wound in his home, alongside other curiosities from across the empire. Guests touched it as if by doing so, they could claim some piece of his legendary bravery. The school held a funeral. Aquila delivered a speech full of praise carefully crafted to honor Ferox without hinting at the system's guilt. His words became a model for future eulogies. Death was framed as noble sacrifice, the final gift of a loyal son to his Roman family. And outside in the streets of Rome, Ferox's legend grew. Performers reenacted his most famous battles, adding flourishes of magic or divine favor. Kids played gladiator games, arguing over who got to be Ferox. Poets wrote verses, placing him alongside mythical heroes. His Germanic roots were recast as noble lineage, his slavery rewritten as willing service to the empire. The men he'd killed became unworthy opponents, granted mercy by his blade. Artists carved his face into monuments, but it wasn't really his face. It was a perfected version, a symbol more than a man. People who cheered as he died now walked past statues that bore no resemblance to the real Ferox, honoring a fiction they helped create. The school's records were altered too, adding victories, inflating achievements, turning him into something larger than life. His old cell became a shrine. Visitors bought charms, oils, miniature weapons, supposedly based on his gear. The space where he'd once doubted hurt and hope became a tourist stop that kept the school's coffers full. Future gladiators were measured against his myth, their real struggles crushed under impossible expectations. And in the end, the most powerful transformation was how the system erased its own guilt. Rome remembered Ferox's courage but forgot his chains. They celebrated his strength but ignored his suffering. The boy who'd been sold for 120 denarii, who'd killed and bled for their entertainment, who'd learned too late that fame was another kind of prison, he was gone. In his place stood a legend, one that served the empire even better than the man had. 3 days after his blood soaked the sand, new slaves arrived at the forum. The money from Ferox's career ticket sales bets merchandise. The auction of his remains had paid for 12 new boys. The cycle began again. Aquila moved through the line of captives with the eye of a man picking stock. He wanted the same traits that had made Ferox a success: broad shoulders, thick bones, fast reflexes, the right age for training and fighting. The other buyers knew the signs too. Prices rose as they competed for the best prospects. One Gallic boy, a dead ringer for young Ferox, sold for 130 denarii, adjusted for the inflation Ferox's fame had caused. Back at the school, the process restarted. The same drills, the same diets, the same psychological tricks that turned people into performers. The veterans who had learned brutality from Ferox now passed those lessons to the newcomers. Cruelty kept itself alive without much help from the trainers. It had become part of the culture. In the arena, the crowd didn't miss a beat. They welcomed new faces, eager for fresh stories, new legends. The system didn't need Ferox's name. It needed Body's blood spectacle. And it got them. Merchants swapped out Ferox's image for the next rising star. The economy built on his body moved on without a pause. Senators' daughters sent gifts to new gladiators, their letters full of the same empty praise they'd once offered Ferox. Everything repeated itself. The empire spread, building new arenas needing more gladiators. Military campaigns delivered the raw material captives to fill the sands to keep the crowds fed with violence. The machine rolled on, fed by conquest driven by demand. Emperors came and went. The policy stayed the same. The system was too entrenched, too profitable to change, and even after Rome fell, the idea survived. Across the world, across the ages, people found new ways to turn human pain into entertainment. New technologies, new faces, same hunger. Ferox was forgotten. The system wasn't. Decades passed. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. But the pattern, the hunger, the machine remained. What started in Roman arenas evolved, adapted, found new shapes in new societies. Different languages, different customs, but always the same core human suffering packaged as entertainment. Individual pain transformed into public spectacle. The details changed, but the principle endured. Rome's grand arenas crumbled, their stones scavenged for other buildings. But the idea of the crowd of violence as theater of turning tragedy into a show that didn't crumble. It was carried forward, woven into the fabric of civilizations that considered themselves more enlightened, more civilized. But at their heart, they still gathered to watch others struggle, bleed, and fall for their amusement. Modern societies didn't need sand and blood-soaked arenas. They found their own versions. Places, screens, and stages where human drama could be consumed safely from a distance. The names were different. The weapons changed, but the appetite that was timeless. The boy who had once stood in a Roman forum, weighed and sold for 120 denarii, had long since been forgotten. His name erased, his scars turned into legend, his story rewritten to serve the system. The crowds that had cheered for him, wept for him, celebrated his rise and fall, they too had been forgotten. But the machine that made him, that consumed him, that profited from every drop of his blood, it kept going, and it kept adapting. Every era found new ways to feed it. Medieval tournaments, public executions, colonial spectacles. Even today, in forms that feel cleaner, safer, more modern, the machine is still with us. We tune in, we watch, we cheer, we judge. We tell ourselves we're better than the Romans, that we're above their cruelty. But the truth is, we've just dressed it in new clothes. Every time we glorify violence, every time we consume another suffering for our own amusement, every time we turn pain into spectacle, the system wins. Ferox's story didn't end with his death. It didn't end with the funeral or the statues or the poems. His story is still being told, just under different names and different voices in different settings. The arena may look different now. The sand may have been replaced by stages, screens, or feeds. But the crowd's hunger, that's the one thing that has never changed. The gladiator games weren't just about blood. They were about power, about control, about turning people into products, into tools, into entertainment. That's what made them so dangerous. Not just the violence, but the way that violence was made normal. The way the crowd learned to cheer for cruelty, to see another's suffering as part of the show. And when that happens, when systems make cruelty feel ordinary, that's when we should stop and think. Because the real danger isn't in the sword or the sand. It's in what we come to accept, what we let ourselves enjoy, what we tell ourselves is just entertainment. So the next time you're tempted to think we're nothing like the Romans, remember Ferox. Remember the system that built him up just to tear him down. Remember how easy it was for the crowd to fall in love with violence, as long as it was packaged the right way. And ask yourself how much has really changed. We might not gather in stone arenas anymore, but we still gather, we still watch, we still cheer, and the machine still feeds. Ferox's story ends where so many of these stories do, not with a single death, but with the system moving on, unchanged, unstoppable. 3 days after his blood soaked the Colosseum sand, the slave traders were back at the forum. Fresh faces, new bodies. 12 boys bought with the profit Ferox had generated in life and in death. His remains funded the next generation of fighters. His sacrifice wasn't mourned by the system, it was reinvested. Marcus Crassus, Aquila walked the rows of captives with the same practiced eye he'd used the day he bought Ferox. He looked for the same signs: strong shoulders, dense bones, the quick animal reflexes that meant survival. Age just right, old enough to train, young enough to last. The formula hadn't changed. Why would it? The system had no reason to evolve when it worked so efficiently. The auctions followed familiar rhythms. Buyers raised hands, prices rose, boys were sold, chains were fitted. The Gallic boy who reminded everyone of young Ferox fetched a high price. The system didn't just create heroes, it created demand for copies. At the gladiator school, the cycle restarted without a pause. The same brutal training, the same Hunger Games disguised as brotherhood, The same rewards and punishments designed to mold human beings into weapons. The veterans who had learned to be cruel from Ferox now taught that cruelty to the new arrivals. The culture kept itself alive. No extra effort needed from the Romans who owned the place. And in the stands of the arena, the crowd welcomed the new faces with the same excitement they'd shown Ferox at his peak. Names changed, but the show stayed the same. Blood spilled and the people cheered. The empire expanded. New arenas rose in new provinces. The demand for fighters never stopped. Every military conquest delivered more captives, more raw material to feed the machine. Rome exported its laws, its language, and its hunger for violence dressed as sport. Conquest wasn't just about territory. It was about supplying the endless appetite for spectacle. Emperors came and went, but the policies stayed the same. Leaders changed, but the machine didn't care. The system outlived them all, and when the empire itself finally fell, the idea survived. The machine found new names, new faces, new technologies. But at its core, it stayed the same, turning human suffering into entertainment, building profit on pain. The arenas became theaters, screens, platforms. The sand became stages, feeds, streams. The audience kept gathering. The appetite never faded. That's the legacy of Ferox. Not the statues carved in his image, not the poems written in his honor, not the myths that grew around his name, but the machine that made him, that consumed him, that turned his life and death into currency and kept going. And it's worth asking, when we watch, when we cheer, when we consume, have we really moved beyond Rome? Or have we just changed the packaging? Because cruelty doesn't survive through chaos. It survives through structure, through systems that outlast individuals, through the rituals and routines that turn the extraordinary into the ordinary, the unthinkable into the expected. Ferox's story is ancient, but it's also right here, right now, still playing out in ways we may not want to see. The names are different, the faces are different, but the machine hasn't changed at all.